we have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Alan Hansen, who for the last 40 years or more has had a career within virology. He's currently the chairman of the Influenza Specialist Group, which is where he and I got into contact with each other. He does a lot of consultation work throughout Australia and globally as well. He's a member of the Australian Government Advisory Committee on Influenza and Pandemic Preparedness, and he also works internationally. Today we're going to really focus with influenza and the workplace, because we find that there seems to be a little bit of a miscomprehension about what to do, how to manage a workforce with influenza, how to deliver education, and some of the really nitty-gritty science behind it. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Alan.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Sue. What I'm going to do is to cover a number of areas of influenza and talk about what the disease is, the illness itself, the viruses that cause it, the impact of the disease, how we can deal with it, particularly with reference to the workplace, and quite a bit about vaccines and vaccination. So there's background here that's, I guess, some of the science that relates to influenza. I'll make it simple, but I think it's important for people to be able to really appreciate more about this illness. So what is influenza? And clinically, it's fairly typical when you get full-blown influenza. It's a fever with chills, myalgia, muscle aches and pains, headache and cough. And these are things we call influenza-like symptoms or influenza-like illness. We contrast that with the common cold, which is more often runny nose, rhinitis. You often get sinusitis, but you very seldom get a temperature or myalgia, the systemic symptoms. But there is an overlap, unfortunately, and that makes it sometimes a little hard to be sure exactly what we're dealing with. And flu symptoms can actually range from essentially nothing, very little, maybe just a bit like a cold, right through to typical symptoms and even through to pneumonia. Other virus infections, on the other hand, can masquerade as influenza-like on occasions. And on average, we believe that about 15% of the population suffer influenza annually, and about 30% of infants and young children whose immune systems have not been exposed previously. The acute symptoms usually last for about 3 to 5 days, but the cough that you get with influenza can certainly persist for a long time, weeks or even months on occasions. And typical workplace studies that look at the impact of influenza look for absences of 3 days or more as being typical absences due to influenza. We have to remember that adults suffer maybe 2 to 3 colds a year, more frequently if you've got young children, because children suffer lots of colds, 6 to 10 a year, and they spread it fairly liberally. So people often say they've had a touch of the flu, and it may just be that, but more likely it is a common cold on most occasions. When we talk about epidemiology, we mean what happens with the disease. And with influenza, we have repeated infections throughout life. That's unusual. We don't normally get repeated infections of any disease. It's seasonal in temperate climates, but year-round in the tropical areas. And I've just put up a little graph here that shows the winter season in red for the southern hemisphere, and in blue for the northern hemisphere, and showing that you tend to get flu year-round in the tropical areas. That's important for people who are travelling overseas to know that influenza can be there at any time when you're going through tropical areas. And we say that it has a rapid or explosive spread quite often. If you get it into a particular environment, nursing homes, places like that, it will go through a population within a very short period of time and infect a high percentage of people. And we do have outbreaks every year. We have fairly frequent epidemics, and we have occasionally what we call pandemics, worldwide epidemics that sweep around the globe, totally new influenza virus that's come out of nowhere quite often and infects many, many people. Now I'm just going to show you a graph of laboratory confirmed notifications of influenza in Australia over a 5-year period. And what you will see is that that varies quite dramatically in terms of the numbers from one year to the next. Now I should explain that laboratory confirmed influenza is just that. It's people who've actually had a laboratory test to determine that they have in fact got influenza and not just the symptoms of influenza. And it would be fairly rare for people to actually be tested. Most commonly your doctor would say, look, you've probably got influenza, go home and go to bed. But people in hospitals, severely ill, high fevers and the like, are likely to be tested. And there are some people who doctors would test because they're participating in a surveillance program to see what's happening in the community. And as a part of planning for severe outbreaks, the government made it obligatory to report laboratory confirmed influenza just to give us a handle on what was happening. And in this graph you'll see in 2009 we had a lot of people shown to be positive for influenza with this so-called swine flu pandemic. And if you have a look to the right in 2012, we've had quite a big year this year. The 2009 might be exaggerated a little bit because people were terribly aware of the fact that there was this pandemic flu spreading, and so a lot more people will have been tested than normal. The other way we can look at the impact or the amount of influenza in the community is by surveillance programs that doctors run in most of our states, looking at influenza-like illness. And you can see these lines on this current graph showing that in 2009, again, we had a very big year. But in comparison with that, this year has probably similar in terms of overall proportion to the 2009, but occasionally you will see a lot more influenza-like illness, as in 2008, than was shown by the laboratory testing. So it really depends how we're looking at influenza as to the impression we get as to just how much there's been there. Have a little bit of a look at the influenza viruses. Influenza is the infection with viruses of a group that's known as the orthomyxoviruses. Now that won't mean much to you. But it's important to know is what a virus really is. And unlike other life forms, including bacteria, a virus is a little package of genetic material. It's not a living thing as such, and it can only replicate itself or multiply once it gets inside a living cell.
I think that's quite interesting, Alan.
Particular animals.
I think that's quite interesting, as so many of us think that it's a living thing.
Yeah, it is a living thing in as much as it can take over your cells once it gets into them. It then directs your cell as a factory for more virus, in effect. And it's usually specific for a particular type of animal species, distemper, for example, in dogs, and for a particular organ. And influenza tends to be a respiratory infection. But I've just put up a little picture here of all sorts of different viruses, just showing how diverse they are. They're enormously diverse. And what I often say to people is, from one virus to another, the genetic difference and the shape and size is more dramatically different than the difference between a mouse and an elephant.